They told him not to look down there, not because it was dangerous in the way cliffs or rattlesnakes were dangerous, but because some places carried a weight that could bend a man's soul if he stared too long, and Caleb Harlan had lived 40 hard years believing that rules carved by fear were meant to be tested, especially on land he owned with sweat, blood, and lonely nights under a merciless sky. So when the old foreman grabbed his sleeve and whispered, "That ravine is off limits, Caleb. Don't even let your shadow fall into it," Caleb laughed the dry laugh of a rancher who had buried droughts, debt, and 2 brothers, and he rode anyway, the horses' hooves thudding like a countdown as the sun dipped low, painting the plains in copper and ash, and the closer he came the quieter the land grew, birds gone, wind stilled, as if the world itself held its breath, and that was when he saw the fence, not a proper fence but a jagged line of posts hammered in desperation, splintered and leaning inward like they were afraid of what they contained, and beyond it the ravine yawned open, a long scar in the earth that seemed too straight, too deliberate, and Caleb felt the first warning twist in his gut, a feeling he had ignored before right up until the moment his life changed forever, and he dismounted, boots crunching on gravel that hadn't shifted in decades, the air colder there, carrying a smell like wet iron and old smoke, and from behind him came the echo of the foreman's voice, distant now, pleading, but pride is a louder thing than wisdom, and Caleb stepped to the edge and looked down, expecting shadows, bones maybe, some old accident the men had exaggerated into legend, but what he saw was worse because it was orderly, horrifyingly so, the ravine floor carved with symbols cut deep into stone, circles within circles, stakes driven into the ground in careful patterns, remnants of rope, chains, and blackened posts, and at the center, a pit, smooth as if polished by hands. And the pit was a mouth that would never stop hungering, and if it rose, if it reached the surface, it would not stop at fences or property lines, so Caleb ran, not away from the ravine but toward the barn, shouting for every hand to mount up, and when they saw his face they did not argue, because a man who has looked into something older than fear carries it in his eyes, and he ordered them to drive the cattle, every last head, toward the ravine, and the men protested, cursed him, begged him to explain, but he loaded dynamite with shaking hands and shouted over the rising wind that had come out of nowhere, and as the first cattle balked at the edge, eyes rolling white, Caleb fired his rifle into the air and forced them forward, the animals tumbling, breaking, falling into the pit in a chaos of sound and dust, and the murmuring below turned into a howl, furious, ravenous, and then he lit the fuse, not one but many, setting charges all along the ravine walls, and as the men fled on horseback, Caleb stayed, watching the last fuse spark down to nothing, and when the explosions tore the earth open, the ravine collapsed in on itself, stone grinding stone, the pit swallowed under tons of rock and flesh and fire, and the sound that rose then was not a howl but a scream that shook the sky, and when it finally ended, there was silence again, heavier than before, and Caleb dropped to his knees, knowing what he had done, sacrificed his herd, his livelihood, buried a truth so terrible it could never surface, and when the foreman returned, pale and shaking, he asked what Caleb had seen, and Caleb said only, "Enough," and in the days that followed the land changed, grass grew greener but thinner, water tasted clean but cold, and at night Caleb dreamed of circles closing, of eyes opening beneath stone, and he never fenced that place again, never let anyone camp there, and when outsiders asked why a prosperous rancher would lose everything overnight and still refuse to sell, Caleb cattle, strange things began to surface, not from the ground but from the people, starting with the foreman, Eli Crow, a man who had ridden with Caleb for 20 years and had seen men die without blinking, yet now woke screaming every night, swearing he could hear hooves running beneath his floorboards, and then the neighbors started talking about lights moving under the fields like lanterns carried by invisible hands, and dogs refused to cross the southern fence line, whining and digging their claws into the dirt as if the earth itself burned them, and Caleb pretended not to notice, burying himself in repairs, in paperwork, in whiskey, because a rancher knows when to fix and when to endure, but deep inside he understood the truth he would never say out loud, that the pit had not been destroyed, only fed, and fed things grow, and one night, when the moon hung low and red like a warning sign nailed to the sky, Caleb felt the pull again, that same tightening in his chest that had drawn him to the ravine the first time, and he found himself riding alone, rifle across his lap, not because he wanted answers but because something in the land was calling its debt due, and as he approached the collapsed scar, he saw the ground had shifted, stones sunk inward in a perfect circle, smoother than before, and at the center, a single wooden post had pushed its way up through the dirt, charred black, still warm to the touch, and when Caleb laid his hand on it, the memories returned. Stronger than ever, men bound and blindfolded, a crowd cheering, a child crying, and a voice shouting that some boundaries must be sealed with blood, and Caleb realized then that the horrifying thing he had done was not the sacrifice of his cattle, but the mistake of believing violence could end violence, that by trying to bury the past, he had become part of it, another link in a chain older than his ranch, older than his name, and the ground trembled beneath his boots, not violently but patiently, like. Ravine was never satisfied by destruction, only by intention, and when Eli stepped closer, eyes empty and obedient to something older than fear, Caleb spoke his name like an anchor, reminding him of winters survived, of rides at dawn, of lives saved, and for a moment the ground stilled, the whispering faded, and the post stopped burning his palm, but the silence demanded a price, and Caleb gave it, not with blood, but with truth, confessing aloud the lies his father had told, the land stolen, the deaths hidden, the rituals ignored, and as his voice broke, the earth sighed, the post crumbled to ash, and Eli collapsed to his knees, free, and the ravine sealed itself tighter than stone, leaving only a scar and a warning, and Caleb knew then some horrors end not by force, but by facing them, and as the night swallowed the plains, one rule remained clear: never look away from the truth, or it will look back at you. Subscribe to the channel, because what comes next is darker, deeper, and closer to home.